Hello and welcome to Part of the Furniture. I'm Daniel, Director of Design at CIVIC SQUARE. We're formerly known as Impact of Birmingham, and this is kind of the first in a series of sessions that we're hosting. What we're looking to do here is start to introduce this concept that we've just launched. Last week we opened up a new website, thefrontroom.cc, and the front room is the first phase in our new neighbourhood platform, CIVIC SQUARE. What we've got happening this evening is the CIVIC SQUARE team are online with us today, and we're going to be discussing what the front room means to each of us and sharing inspiration from our homes and our own heritage to start to explore what we can take from the traditional idea of the front room to implement into our neighbourhood platform that we're going to be building. The idea of CIVIC SQUARE is that we will be opening up a physical space in the B16 area of Birmingham, and it's set to be a public square, a neighbourhood economics lab, and a creative and participatory ecosystem. And so what it's all about is looking at regenerative civic and social infrastructure for neighbourhoods. And I think through this series, what we wanted to do with the Part of the Furniture is start to look at what that really means, and using the front room and the furniture of the front room as a metaphor for infrastructure. Now, the front room, when we started to explore the idea of the front room and what it really means, and to different people, we realized it's such an emotive, and it provokes like really strong responses from people, which is really interesting. And we found out that it's really because it's such a visceral, sensory idea, the front room. Like it had a lot of paraphernalia, a lot of different ways that it manifested in different people's homes. So everyone that we've kind of spoken to so far about the idea of the front room, they get it and they have this idea of what it is. And so we thought it was interesting to host this conversation so that we could unpack what different people's perspectives on the front room are, and what aspects of the idea of the traditional front room we actually do want to implement in a space for a neighbourhood. And so before we get started, I just wanted like each of the CIVIC SQUARE team just to say hello, tell us your name and what your role is, I guess, in CIVIC SQUARE.
Hi, I'm Imi. I like to call myself a co-founder and director, but legally, I guess I would be on the papers as the CEO.
Hi, my name's Andy. I'm the Director of Regenerative Economics.
Hey, I'm Indy and I'm the Operations Director at CIVIC SQUARE.
Hi, I don't know if you can see me. I'm kind of in the sunlight, in the light, dark a little bit. I'm Nikki. I'm Programming and Participation Lead.
Hello folks, I'm Bing, the Creative Director of CIVIC SQUARE.
Hi, I'm Danny or Zaz, and I work on the creative engagement at CIVIC SQUARE.
Cool, thanks everyone. And I think Amy should be joining us soon, so she'll say hey when she comes on. But yeah, we're introducing the front room in this format as well, obviously because of the context that we're in, having to socially distance. But I think there's some interesting opportunities just with this moment to really dig into how people are living in their own front rooms and their own living rooms at this time. And it gave us the opportunity to sort of explore some of those things while we're actually in those spaces. So the upcoming series will be inviting people to come on in the same format as the team here to come and share their own perspectives. And we'll share a bit more about those sessions later on. But at this time, the key question that we wanted to explore this evening is about what it is that we really want to take from the front room as inspiration to implement into the neighbourhood platform, and actually what things might we want to adapt or leave behind in the idea of the front room so that we can start to shape the culture and the essence of the space that we want to create. In a similar way as I was explaining earlier, the front room in the furniture, in the different objects, in the material culture of the space, it carried a lot of meaning, it carried a lot of ideas, a lot of aspirations, ideals for families. And in the same way, the space that we're looking to create in the neighbourhood, we would like it to have a similar function. Imagine if we had the same sort of emotive response that people have to their own front rooms, to a space in your community. So at this time, what we've asked each of the team to do is to come and share a few stories or ideas from their own like history or connection with the front room, so that we can start to draw from these experiences and discuss the things that we might take and actually implement in the front room when we go into actually building it. So I'm going to open up the space to the panelists to just come and share.
I don't mind starting.
Nice.
So in terms of the front room, my kind of personal experience with it has been a place that's been really tied with lots of different types of emotions. So for me personally, my grandparents really started to integrate me into the front room as like when I was a child. So my kind of initial ideas and memories of the front room were kind of about it being always like a quieter place. It wasn't a place where everyone would go to, but important things happened in there. So I always remember my grandparents going into the front room and then our family members coming around when they were doing their partner. And that was like a really big thing, this idea of sharing wealth, what that meant as well with like a community and kind of everyone being able to chip in a little bit, but actually everyone almost eats, if that makes sense. You know, like it's not just one person benefiting, but actually as a community doing that. And the thing with the front room was that I always remember there being lots of like trinkets and lots of objects that were constantly there, constantly on display. And it really like reflected who my grandparents were. So there were kind of things that would link to their own space, like when they were in Jamaica, and almost like these small things that they like brought with them or kind of bought to feel at home. So even for myself, like I collect like a lot of like trinkets and small kind of things. Like I brought them with me. I like bought this like not too long ago, and I was in like a random small like vintage store, and I saw it and I was like, oh, I really want that. And there was this feeling of like, why do I really want that? What is that about? But it's one of those objects that reminds me of the front room, something that you put to one side and you can, you know, you open it and there's like random things in there. Like in this one, I've got like some shells in there that I picked up when I was in Wales. And it's this idea of wherever that box is, someone sees that and they see me. And I think they're the ideas of the kind of the front room. And just going back to my point of how my grandparents integrated me into the front room. Me and my dad used to have a tradition, like on a Friday, he'd pick me up and then we would go to McDonald's and then we'd go to my nan and granddad's house. So when I'd get like these toys from like my Happy Meal, I would always just like leave them like just lying around, and then I'd come back to my nan and granddad's the next week and my nan would have like put them on the side. And that was really kind of their way of saying that like I was kind of like an important role, like I was an important like person in their life. And I think with things like that natural like integration, like my nan never just put those toys away. It was kind of like they were on display with everything else. And I think that was their kind of way of showing that I was as much an important part of their life as they were to mine as well. And I think we start to kind of pull that out through these ideas and experiences around the front room.
Amazing. There's a lot in what you just shared. And one of the things that was coming to mind just a moment ago is just this idea of like, well, you shared that that box that you've, it's kind of like just like a trinket, an object that kind of represents who you are.
Yeah.
And this idea that like these objects represent who we are and have a place that's visible by lots of people leads us to a sense of sort of belonging in that place. I think belonging is a key kind of concept that we want to kind of explore within the front room, especially given the context of the work, going into a place that's being regenerated and a lot of people are just moving in, or some people are moving out, and people will be coming and going, and how do you create that sense of belonging and facilitate that? So yeah, thanks for sharing that. And just to remind people, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. Please feel free to comment on anything anyone's saying. And Zaz will probably come back to some of the points that you made. Amy's joining us now as well, which is cool. But before we bring Amy in, I'm just going to go to someone else to share some stories.
I'll happily go next. So hi, I'm Amy again. So I think I've been thinking all weekend, like more deeply about the context of the front room in my family and what it meant to me growing up, and then also what it continues to mean as we go forward. So both my parents' houses, both houses that we lived in, and my grandparents' house started off with a front room, a visible kind of divider between any other room in the house, and it was beautifully curated and kept very clean, although my parents and my grandparents were really next level and are really next level on cleaning, so it wasn't that different to the rest of the house, but it was definitely kept sacred for people coming round. So there was things that really jumped out just as little experiences growing up. So we still had a fair bit of gender division growing up. The guys would sit in one part of the house and the women would sit in another part of the house, and the women were largely doing like a lot of the kitchen stuff, and then the kids would have to, when people came round, and people came round all the time, morning, noon, night, no like phoning in advance and booking a slot. They would like come in whenever, any time of the day. It isn't unusual to have a knock at the door. And at any point of the day, what I remember is it was never unusual to have food, tea, everything ready. There was never like a time where you'd be like, we've got nothing in, or oh, how come they've come? I never even remember my parents or my grandparents ever saying, oh my God, like they've turned up. It was just normal. They would be able to get out of the freezer like samosas and pakoras that had been made beforehand, fry them, stick them in a plate. And us kids, especially the female children, the older you get, you'd walk from the kitchen to the front room with the tray, put the tea down, and we'd be taught like, this is how you do it. Like you don't, there was little habits that I never really understood. You never just take the teapot in your hand. You always have to put things on a tray, and you have to serve. And there was like all these little rituals that we were learning. And that happened both in my grandparents' house and my parents' house. It was like a training camp for how you host and how you be and how you always make people feel welcome. And then interestingly, I started to think about all the positives that had. But of course, there was no doubt that there was things in that whole structure that were not, I don't want to say negative, but there were things that needed to be deconstructed. Gender roles. And I don't just mean gender roles as in women are in the kitchen and men weren't, because largely the men were shouldering a different economic burden, a significant one of bringing their family across and stuff. So I never remember gender roles being this one of like, oh, the women are doing all the cooking and they're really mad about it, and the men are just having their feet up. There was always this really deep mutual respect between why genders were doing certain things. And I was really glad that I remembered that this weekend, because whilst it was divided by gender roles, it was definitely about a mutual respect. And I think we still have that in our family around a mutual respect of the labour people are carrying as opposed to what they're supposed to do. But then of course, those things also had negative patriarchal connotations and things that had travelled with them from Punjab and India, and there was things that as kids were growing up we definitely wanted to unpack. And so one really key thing that I just wanted to share in this story before I tell you about one item is both my grandparents' house and my parents' house, they both knocked through the front room and made open plan living in both of their houses. And I was thinking about this because my grandmother passed away a couple of weeks ago, so we've obviously been reflecting a lot in our family. And there was reminders of these big cultural shifts where the family started to unpack some of those things, and the pressure was off our parents and our grandparents in different ways. And we were growing up and we were living more communally, and we were still doing the same stuff of hosting and nurturing and there was still deep respect. There was very rarely like fights about gender or gender inequalities in our family, but it was interesting that literally very physically both front rooms got knocked out into an open plan. My grandmother's house went open plan, and I remember my mum and my aunt being the ones that really said, look, maybe we could create a bit more space. And there was almost like a physical breaking down of those barriers and opening up. And same in my mum and dad's house that I live in now, which is their second house they've ever lived in, so it's not as modest as the first one, but they knocked through and they created this open plan, and all the family are together, and even though the same people are generally cooking, they're all happening in a together space. But that hosting like still really matters, and that's something that I think has been powerful for me, which is that we've taken the things that I remember about hosting and receiving and welcoming, and we've kept that, but we've broken down some other barriers. And there was one memory that really stands out about the calls that my granddad would get from India, and we always used to like laugh because he'd be like shouting down the phone as if he was trying to shout to India, and we'd be like, yo, the phone is a reason, the phone's there so you phone, right? You're not shouting to India. But if a call came from India, like the whole house would just go quiet, and we'd be like, okay. And this would happen like a lot. So maybe like every day there'd be one call from someone in the village. And in the early years, it was definitely about money they were sending over, problems that were happening. My granddad looked out for a lot of his sisters, but I definitely remember him going into the front room, shutting the door and being like, you know, we need to take this call. And to finish on an item, the item, I'm going to just use the example of like having something in a frame on the wall, because I think the front room, and even now the living room, but more importantly the front room, when we were, my family were new to the country, we were definitely not in the space that we are now, which is more confident. It was a place of aspiration, but it wasn't just a place of aspiration to like the British gaze. It was a place of aspiration, a reminder of who they were, so similar to Danny about trinkets and things like that. And it was lots of reminders of who we want to be. And I'm just looking around, I've got one room, which is my kitchen and my living room together, and lots of the things on my walls and posters and books that I have are very much about who I want to be in the world. So when I think about the front room in the Commons, in the neighbourhood for everyone to own, I feel like it's a part of history, of our history, but it's also part of who and what we want the world to be, and that's what the front room really means to me, and why I'm so glad it's such a key concept within how we're introducing Civic Square.
Thanks, Imi. Who wants to go next?
So I think my views of the front room are very different. When I was growing up, I suppose they were actually more places of flux and kind of variety as much as anything, and we didn't quite have the same kind of sanctity or feelings around the front room. So I think it's quite interesting just to sort of, I think one of the most interesting things about the whole topic is to see how it resonates with different people. And I never really remember using the term the front room either. It's always the living room is always our kind of place. And it was a room for living in. It was watching TV, or it was playing games and doing railway tracks and all those types of stuff. But it was also the place where the kind of Christmas decorations were as well, and things like that. It was kind of the place that reflected us as we were growing as a family. And similar to Imi, the kind of images on the walls were either sort of pictures of us at different events, different times and life stages, but also the kind of projection of what we would like to be as well, and things like that. And I think for me that's the kind of the interesting way in which you look at architecture through the years, as well as Imi's talking about the way in which we've kind of broken down some of those physical barriers. But if you look at sort of some of the newer ways in which people are building homes, people are trying to build these cozy little spaces that they've suddenly lost. They've kind of realized that having those smaller rooms are suddenly quite important for a different part of the relaxation and a different time of mind as well. But I think when I was thinking about all the different sort of versions of the front room and what resonates with me as a object. For me, it was always the kind of the fireplace and the mantelpiece that's above the fireplace, and I feel that the fire of kind of being a very deep-rooted thing within human beings anyway, right? About how we kind of sit around fire and talk to each other and kind of reminisce stories and things like that. There used to be quite a lot of kind of storytelling around the fire, and for me that's what those kind of rooms were for. It was always about the warmth that you generated from it, the ability to cook on it if you wanted to. Like, really remember cooking crumpets on an open fire was like one of the favorite things I remember from being a child. But then the kind of interesting kind of space that the mantelpiece then creates as well, like it creates this special place in amongst the room almost, where you can put your favorite trinkets and things like that. And I think my mum stopped putting trinkets in the living room when me and my brother knocked them off about 3 times playing football in the living room, so that might be why we didn't have quite the same sacredness around it. But I think when I started kind of creating or started looking for features in homes as I grew up, things like fireplaces were quite important without really knowing why and things like that. And so it's interesting to see how that now plays out in a different kind of way, I suppose, and how interested the kind of people see the idea of the front room in different parts of the architecture of their homes now. I think that's quite interesting, is how it's a much more flexible concept, in that people use the garden as a place to entertain and to gather and things like that, in ways that you maybe would have traditionally used the front room, but because there wasn't a garden space or similar kind of thing. So I think I'm quite interested in how different people's backgrounds and people's cultures and contexts creates a whole different view of what the front room or the living room is. And I think identifying those things that kind of tie those things together rather than pointing out differences will be really important as we kind of go forward.
Thanks, Andy. Indy?
Hey, Mindy. So I've got loads of memories of, like, not just our front room, but particularly like our back room, our kitchen. We had a very big garden and stuff. So I'm just going to talk a bit about like some of the memories from all of that, and then sort of bring it together with some of the stuff that I think, like particular objects and stuff. I think when we were growing up, my parents very much shielded us from a lot of the stuff that I think they were dealing with, because lots of stuff, as you can imagine, was what was happening. But as children, and I'm one of 5, you know, we never really got to know about it, and they shielded us from a lot of that. And a lot of my memories from my childhood is all about just like warmth, you know, fun. My parents were always, and I can imagine they're probably going through a lot of stuff, but you know, they always had a smile on their face, you know, always playing with us, always taking us places. And particularly, you know, in our front room, like we'd have back room, sorry, we had a fireplace and stuff, and you know, we spent a lot of time in there, and you know, chatting to each other. We were quite a big family and stuff, but outside of the family, we had a community as well. And particularly, a little bit like what Amy said, our house was very much an open house. And I remember that growing up, you know, it wasn't just for our family. It was like, you know, people will come, you know, not phoning or anything, just turn up on the doorstep, and you know, particularly on the weekends as well. And you know, our house would be open all weekend. My parents, not just my mum as well, like it would be my dad, you know, he'd have grown stuff in our garden, like potatoes and peas and all sorts, and they'd be there cooking together in big pots, and you know, and we'd be like, they'd be hosting lots of people all of the time, with lots of care, lots of warmth. You know, and we would, you know, as children and stuff, we'd all just like chip in and we'd just do it. It was really normal for us to have like, you know, like growing up with lots of people around, you know, never really having a lot of negativity, you know, with all of the community. It would be a Sikh community, and you know, we'd like pray together, we'd be singing together, we'd chat together, and a lot of our weekends were filled with all of that. So you know, it's, you know, which was very different to some of the, you know, when I talk back to like some friends and people now, like their sort of upbringing was quite different to like what I remember as a child. and I don't know whether my parents did it on purpose or whatever. And I don't know if it was a good thing or bad thing, really, because obviously then dealing with something when you grow up and it sort of hits you a little bit, oh, how do we deal with this? Because even now, when we have something, we go straight to our parents. Even I'm up 42 now, and I'll go to my parents and be like, oh God, guess what? And, you know, I don't know what to do. And they're still sort of like helping us deal with all that, because they're really positive all of the time. And I don't know whether, I think religion has a lot to do with that, particularly my dad, like, you know, is very positive and stuff. But what I really remember is like my mom, I think when they were younger, when they were in India, like they did a lot of embroidery. So there'd be loads of like blankets, pillowcases and stuff like that she'd embroidered herself, and her sisters had embroidered, and she'd have like suitcases full of them. So on our weekends, they'd all come out, like, because people would stay over as well. And I really remember all of that. And when me and my sisters got married, like she gifted us like one of those, she'd had like suitcases full of them, and she gifted us with all of these like hand embroidered like little blankets and pillowcases and stuff. And that you know, is really, particularly my sister, actually, like she was, you know, she did a lot of that because she saw it, and she embroidered lots of stuff. I think that the whole sort of hosting and the warmth, and, you know, just the care that my parents sort of like, and hospitality that they gave people as they entered like our house, was really important. And I think even now, I don't know, like some people will know me, particularly Imi, that, you know, anybody that comes into the house, it's like, you know, they can't leave without like having something to eat and drink, and lots of it. Like there's always food, always drink, doesn't matter. Like, you know, nobody, not my sisters, like my brother, like even now my brother's friends and stuff go to my parents' house. They're like really old now, like in their 70s, and, you know, they don't qualm about it at all. Like, you know, my mum would be like, oh, let me make you something and stuff. And so I think it's almost like embroidered in our blood to be like hosts for people, like to, you know, to serve people. So yeah, my memories are quite fun and really warm, and like, you know, very much like, you know, what we as a family did for others and our community, and what we did for each other, was quite a warm feeling, really, growing up.
Thanks, Indy. Amy, do you want to go next?
Hello everyone. So growing up, my front room was I find this quite an emotive subject, so I apologise if it is emotional. I grew up in quite a violent home, and there was a lot of alcohol. And the front room was the domain of my dad, and the kitchen was the domain of my mum. So the front room, for me growing up, was quite an unsafe place, and quite a violent place, and a place that you just didn't really go most of the time, majority of the time. But then I suppose the evolution of that is as a grown up, my mum is we left my dad. We kind of fled my dad when I was about 9, and then we had a small time. I suppose we would now be seen to be homeless. We were like living in different places, and then when we did move into our own house, it was me, my mum and my brother. You could tell that the front room then kind of took on this place, that it was very much the domain of my mum, and that was quite powerful, and it still is now, that she has all her things around. And like Andy said, like the fireplace, very important for, you know, trinkets and things that she's found and things that she's interested in, and it was very much when we go and stay with her, like it's basically where we spend all our time. And she's like fiercely into EastEnders, so when EastEnders is on, it's on like painfully loud, so no one else can hear what's going on. And she like shushes you if you try and talk to her when she's watching EastEnders. But it's like it's kind of like this, it's like the salvation, it's like the sanctuary, it's and I've never really considered it before having this conversation, but it's almost like it's kind of taking back what she was not afforded when we were all grown up. So it's quite a powerful place in a way. And now the front room in my house is actually the playroom, which is a strange irony from my work with children. But it's the room at the front of the house, so you can see it from the streets, and there's rainbows on the windows, and it's a complete mess. I'm not going to turn my camera around, but yeah, it's a place of joy and happiness and sanctuary and conflict, but like conflict of the best kind, like I was playing with that, give it back. And so I suppose I'm interested in the concept of the front room in being a joyful place for children. Daniel had a conversation with me a little while ago about sometimes growing up in particular decades, the front room was a place where children were seen and not heard, and things were kept tidy, and so there wasn't much of a ruckus to be made, or no mess to be made. And I quite like to reclaim that idea and actually make the front room a place where children can be, and that they are welcome and visible there, and they're welcome to do their thing. So that's the kind of the thing within our front room, within this channel, that I'm interested in developing more.
Great, thank you, Amy. And it's really powerful, like the story of how the space reclamation piece in that you were talking about. I found that really fascinating, and just looking at some of the history of the front room and like how different generations have used it. There's a lot to be learned, and I'm looking forward to exploring that more with more people, just like how it was with their grandparents and then their parents, and then now, like there's lots that we can learn about that. So thanks, Amy. Nikki, did you want to go next?
Yes, thanks, Daniel. Thanks for sharing that, Amy. There was bits of that and bits of what Amy and Indy said that I could definitely connect to. And I don't want to give away my age, but I think I was that generation where you were seen but not heard in the front room. Because our front room growing up was very much the place. So we lived in a terraced house in Smethwick growing up, a family of 5 siblings, and when my brother got married, his wife then moved in with us as well. So it was quite a small house for that many people, but it was the room that was always kept tidy. It was a room where we kind of received visitors, where all the important conversations happened. We wouldn't go into that room unless we were opening the front door, because the house that we lived in, it was a terraced house, which the front door opened onto the pavement. There was no little garden to welcome people. You literally opened the front door onto the street. So it was one of those places where we as children growing up never used that space at all. It was the space where it was spotless, it was immaculate, it had those little, probably not so much trinkets, it had, embarrassed to say, it had those plastic flowers that grew up in the 80s, many houses in Smethwick had, and everyone was proud of them. And it's almost the equivalent of the flying, ducks, I think. That was our equivalent. So, but we had like these doilies that my brother's wife, my sister-in-law, would knit, and she would like hand dye, and they would like almost took pride of place on the sofas. So growing up, we didn't call them sofas, we called them settees. And I remember our front room had quite indicative of the 80s, the velvet wallpaper, the black embossed wallpaper. I don't know if anybody remembers it. I've got photos somewhere, and I'm like looking back now, I'm like, what were my parents thinking of? But it was all, the rage back in those days, and it was the room that the elders in the community would come. So my family was very much, we were isolated in terms of our immediate family. So it was just my mum, my brother, my siblings. My dad spent a lot of time overseas, and our rest of my family, my nan and my aunts and uncles, all lived in Yorkshire. So we didn't see them that often. So because where we lived, my mum was probably seen as the elders. So my mum would have visitors. The people would come and see my mum, or my brother would have his mates round. And for us growing up, the heart of our kind of lives was the living room or the kitchen. The kitchen was quite small, so if you wanted to have a gossip or you wanted to have a play, you'd come round the back through the alleyway into the living room, and that's where you'd sit and chat. But if you wanted to have those serious conversations, it would always be in the front room. It was immaculate. It was a place where we probably didn't get that many people during the week, but the weekends was when, you'd make nice food because you knew you'd get people out of town coming, or because everyone was at work. So picking up from what Emmy was saying about the kind of gender balance, the women were always the ones who did the hosting, and it was almost as told, we were never told you had to take things in a tray, but you just knew. And I think it's because you'd seen your elders do it. And even to this day, you know, my father's passed away now, but he would hate it if you were to take a cup of tea for a visitor just by hand. You know, you would have to have the tray with a plate of biscuits and the teapot and all of those things. So it's kind of carried through. But kind of, I'm looking at my house now and the houses I've grown up until the house that I live in now, the one that I own with my husband and you know, my family. Our front rooms were always to receive visitors, to receive guests, and to have that gender where, you know, if the blokes would come, they'd go and sit in the front room, the women would automatically go into the living room. But now I think it's kind of that kind of social gender divide's kind of broken. Our living room and our front room is one. You know, people who come to our house are our family, our friends, people that we want to socialise with, that we want to spend time with, and they automatically come into the living room. Whether it's messy, whether it's, you know, tidy, it doesn't matter. That's where people would go. And it's people that you don't know would go into the front room. I mean, at the moment, I've been, the team will know, we've spent the last 18 months doing the house up. So I currently don't have a living room or a front room because my front room was turned into a makeshift bedroom because my mum stays with me on a weekend. I messaged Daniel earlier on saying, oh, when we're talking about things, does it have to be for my living room or our front room? Because I'm thinking I've got neither at the moment, and I'm currently sitting upstairs in the loft, and that's why you probably can't see my face because the light is not hitting the window at the moment. So I think for me, the front room was a place of, you know, serious conversation, complex conversations that children didn't or weren't to be part of. And I think moving forward, I think what excites me about the front room and the work that we hope to do with the wider community is kind of sharing those conversations. It's bringing conversations to people and not having that secrecy. So growing up, the conversations in the front room were definitely conversations that the kids shouldn't know about. And I think, you know, getting kids involved at an early age, getting them more informed, you know, being part of the decision making is a key thing. So I think having those conversations, you know, sitting on a settee or a sofa or a couch or wherever you want to call it, or around a table, being together, I think for me, I think I've really enjoyed seeing, because I didn't enjoy the front room growing up. And I think I like the way that we've now reclaimed it. And I think that's what I want it to be, a kind of reclamation of the space. It's a new space for everyone. And it's not like you have to knock on the door to come in. You know, you are part of that space. So yeah, that was the front room then, and that's what the front room is to me now. So that's me. Thanks, Stevie.
Thanks, Nikki. And Bing.
Hello. I've been reflecting a lot about the front room throughout all our different conversations, and I think first sort of unpicking some of the signifiers of the front room, I started to try and figure out which was the front room in my grandparents' house. And I think it was quite a mixed environment. It was a very working class environment. And my granddad's shop was like attached to the house. So people would often come through the shop and then round the back, and then there was like a little garden which would lead you through into the back room technically, but I think it served more as a front room just based on how everyone sort of interacted. Whereas the room from the street, the technical front room, has also some aspects of the front room. So I think it was quite a sort of blended, multifunctional house in general, particularly around work and life. And thinking about this with the front room, I found really interesting in terms of the juxtapositions between those, sort of going straight, my granddad coming straight from the workshop, all like dusty and like having dealt with wood and stuff, and like with his boots just walking straight in, and then the front room sort of being somewhere where there was like best china in little cabinets and stuff, and sort of all of those different like textures and modes, like a mode change when you sort of moved between the thresholds of different rooms, has been really fascinating for me to sort of recall. And I've definitely only experienced the front room as a child, quite a young child, so given this sort of blended lower floor of the house as well, in this instance we were all just sent upstairs. It was like the kids just go upstairs, okay, just play upstairs. We'd like be playing hide and seek and stuff up there, which is loads of fun, and board games and stuff. My granddad had like a study up there, and there was like the bathroom and like a couple of little sort of spare room type things. There's loads of good places to hide. So I think it's interesting to think about just a house in that way and how it functioned in our family. As my gran sort of the matriarch of the family, it was somewhere a lot of us met. But particularly stuff around, like, we've sort of been looking at some different words and associations with the front room, and the one that I think resonates with me the most, sort of in that I've brought forward as well into my sort of life and career, I guess, is around like displaying objects and like what's precious. and sort of like the curation of those objects. So as I say, whilst in the we'll say the front room, in the front back room, like you'd find my auntie like on her typewriter doing the accounts for the family business, and you'd have me there with a little half jack of potato and some butter or whatever at the table. But then you'd have like these beautiful little kind of tea sets and stuff. Like this one pattern that my gran had would just be in like a little cabinet, and then there was a sort of glass case with like figurines and stuff in. And I think it might be an only child thing as well, to kind of really look at these objects often. I almost can't remember many conversations that we had, but I could describe these objects to you. And I think it's because, to me, sort of artifacts represent like stories and people. I could go so far as to say like they represent people to me. So when now I'm sort of, you know, we've got our own flat and stuff, having objects that people have given me or that remind me of people make me feel not alone. They make me feel like I'm part of other people's lives, and there's intersecting sort of stories and stuff there. And I think I've definitely been interested in why these objects matter to my gran in particular, like what they meant for her. And not being an adult, knowing her, we obviously sort of just never had any conversations like that. But in the back room / front room, the other room, my granddad had like a bar. It was such a small room, the bar took up quite a bit of the room, and there was like a little fish tank above it, and it was so cool. And I remember asking him what like the yellow booze was, because it looked really cool, and it was Advocar, which my gran used to enjoy. And it was just and it had like objects on there as well as like this cat, like a really strange stylized cat object, which we've still got in my parents' house, and it just looks down at you from the corner. So the presence of like objects to me was really huge. And I think it might have been a way of dealing with when there was loads of people around, because being an only child in my own home with my parents, there wasn't that much like noise or overstimulation, whereas at my grand's house there was all my cousins and my aunts and stuff, and there was lots going on. And I think I'd sort of look at the patterns on the wallpaper and look at what's going on in the sort of the things that stay still as well as like all the things that are moving, and as a way to sort of ground myself, which is quite interesting, just thinking of like, I guess, a meditative thing to do, almost like being mindful of the room and the structure that isn't changing. It's sort of there each time you go, almost checking in with the cat, like there it is, and there's the other things. So I'm definitely interested in the sort of the curation aspect. And I brought an object. We're all in our home, so I didn't have to really bring it far. Literally brought it from over there. But most of my sort of precious objects and stuff are back in my parents' house. I think it's interesting that, sort of economically speaking, I've not really been able to establish my own rooms as such. Like most of my stuff, or it's still in my sort of bedroom at home. And I do think that sort of makes me, I think that's why the front room is still so key to me in like my grandparents' sense, because we haven't been able to sort of write those stories ourselves. We don't have our own, can't buy our own properties. None of the furniture in the flat is my own, it's rented and stuff. So I think this object is quite interesting because it's a little hand figurine. Put it there. I got this from Wales, Amy. Shout out. From Bo Maris for £2, this little hand. And so when my gran passed away, the set kind of looked like this that she had. It was like a Royal Albert one, I think. And we used to buy her different bits and pieces for it. Like the family would build at the set, they'd buy her bits and pieces because she loved it, and it would go in the case. And when she died, we all chose like a piece from the set to keep, and I kept like a little swan piece, which is in my parents' house back home. But when we were on holiday, I saw this and I was like, oh my God, it's the pattern that my gran loves. It's the same flowers. And so I picked it up. And then I was doing a bit of research about it, and it's actually like a knockoff one. It's like a cheap version. And I found that really interesting around like, especially around sort of preciousness and stuff, like imitation things. Because I already think the things in my gran's case wouldn't be worth very much on like, you know, Antiques Roadshow, or they wouldn't be of interest to a museum in terms of historical importance, or something being really, you know, like it wouldn't bring in a lot of money, it doesn't have a lot of financial value, but they were precious objects, and that sort of gets passed on. And I found this quite interesting that I picked up like a sort of knockoff version of probably an already quite everyday set. I just thought it was quite fascinating, and I definitely as a kid was more drawn to the objects that weren't functional, the ones that were like figurative or kind of decorative, and why they were there, because you know, you couldn't serve tea in them, or you couldn't have like a slice of cake off them. And I find it interesting that people would make objects like that for people to enjoy, I guess, visually, rather than to use. So there's some blended thoughts of my front room.
Thanks, Bing. That thing what you just said about imitation just stood out to me, because just before we started this call, I was reading a little bit about how from migrant communities, when they came over and started their own front room, there was an element of like, well, this is the first time I've owned a house or I've had a space like this, so what do I do with it? And then they'd go to the neighbours or go and see what someone else is doing, and there'd be that element of sort of imitation. So even though all the front rooms were slightly different, they were all kind of the same in different ways. And I just found that interesting in terms of the function of the front room and what it did.
Absolutely. And even on a local level, it made me realise that I was imitating my gran by buying this. Like I wasn't buying an object that I was drawn to and then collecting it. I bought it because it reminded me of my gran, and then when I found out it was an imitation, I was like, oh, it is in many ways then. And I think that idea of recreating something, I guess that's really key in the front room, isn't it? Like recreating something that you don't want to lose, or that's precious, but then doing it with what you have available. Like it's not the sort of the most authentic, it's not sort of returning to somewhere else. You're in, you know, it's like using what you've got to create that.
And I think as well that like idea of like it you like returning to like those memories and those feelings, and then buying something that kind of ties into that for you, even if it's not like authentically you, if that makes sense. So I feel like some of the trinkets I have are not authentically me at all, but just the fact that I connect with it, it almost ties into it being me as well, if that makes sense. I think it's really interesting when you're like looking at how you bring in what you've known like as a child, and how you bring that in, and then you kind of develop it slowly into like, oh, I'm gonna get this like set of plates because this is me, but I also remember my grandparents had a certain set of plates too, and almost like bringing in those like ideas into yourself.
I want to resonate with the piece of imitation, because I think Indy will resonate with this as well, because we've talked about it a lot recently. Both of us lost a close family member in the last month or so, and both of us like I think like Indy, I just go to my parents. Like if anything happens, you pick up the phone and you say, well, what do we do now? But recently, because we've been in lockdown, we've had to be able to figure our own lives out, because we can't just go and sit at our parents' houses. And the idea of imitation has been really interesting, because obviously Indy has kids, and when we were in the middle of finding out lots of sad news, we had to suddenly decide, how do you behave? And there was just this default to like certain things: positivity, collectivity, prayer. It wasn't like we knew that those things made us feel better. We just knew that by replicating how our parents would deal with it, we felt in control of ourselves. So it's really interesting how much of like the tradition of certain things get passed on. And so I'm really interested, because the death of my grandmother has done something really significant to me, because I feel like I spent 35 years asking her why we did things the way we did. Why do people all come round when someone dies? Why is everybody swarming at home by myself? Why is everybody in our front room? Why are people calling the phone non-stop? Why do we do things like this? Why do we do things like that? And I feel like in the last few weeks in lockdown, I've learned why everything was the way it was, because now we've had it all taken away from us. And that idea of like imitation becoming, and those cultures and those rituals, sometimes they weren't able to explain to us. They were just saying, well, no, that's what we do. Like people come together and we talk, and I'm like, but what about if all these people don't make me feel better? And you don't realize until you're then experiencing it that actually these cultures, these traditions, these imitations, they're not just things that people have made up for some random reason. They go on for generations. They're built on generations and generations of learning of how to be together, how to mourn together, how to live together, whatever, in happy or sad times. And so I think that the sight of the front room in for me is quite ritualistic. In sometimes when you don't know what you're doing, it's the rituals that help you to gather yourself and ground yourself again. Or there's a sacredness in maybe the kids not knowing all the pains that they had and what that has meant, because and also the negative side of that as well, and things that we need to break down, and where's that I'm interested in the future about what's going to be the balance between what is sacred, having everybody in everything, or where do you protect people, or where don't you, or where do long held rituals and traditions come in, and where do things need to be reinvented and use the balance. And I'm fascinated by that in the front room for the neighbourhood.
Yeah, I just wanted to just add to that. I think that the balance is the important thing, isn't it? Because like, as much as being shielded from a lot of negativity and stuff, I also think that, you know, having a space where people can just like be able to ask questions and have be told the honest truth is also important. So I guess it's just trying to figure out, like, you know, in a space, in a like open, caring space, like what does that mean to be able to balance it, where you're able to be really open and be yourself, but also be there for like the warmth and the care and all of that sort of stuff. So I'm really interested in how we create that balance.
I think as well, like just going on the back of what Indy's saying, like how you then create like this new balance, and it's almost like you're adding your own part to this history. So it's like we have this understanding of things through like our elders and things like that, and kind of like what Amy was saying, when you're in it and experiencing whatever you're experiencing, you realize why these things happen, and it's almost like we are then adding our own selves into it and like the next part of the journey. Because I remember growing up and always like someone would pass away and then you'd have night, and I always just think like, oh my gosh, there's so many people everywhere. People are bringing ginger beer, people are playing dominoes. I don't get it, but also love it. But at the time I felt like it was just people are coming round to pay their like respects, but then there was also something very different about it. And now as an adult, I understand what that is. It's this idea of like collective mourning, but also being there, sometimes just being in the same place, in the same room. It almost means so much, because it's this idea of coming as you are, and I feel that is something that, you know, sometimes can be lost, and can be lost not just because people don't care, it's not that, but can be lost because we're in situations where we're taken out of those things. Some people don't have a front room, or maybe haven't experienced a front room or a living room in that way. But it's really interesting that, you know, you get to that point where you just understand why these things have happened, because it's in you now and you're like, oh, okay. And I really love that idea of kind of exploring all of that when we, like, as we kind of go through developing the front room, and kind of what rituals people will bring to it, what rituals we bring to it, how does that change, like what does that look like if a 12-year-old is like coming in and like using the front room, what does that mean for them? I'm really interested in how we kind of like tie all those rituals together and are open to developing them too.
Yeah, and that concept you say about, like, you know, being there but not being heard and stuff, and how we bring that in, because like, you know, even my mum says it, like how I am with my two boys, that, you know, they'll ask me something and I'm quite honest about it, and whether it's, you know, whether it's like something really like fun or like whatever, or whether it's quite grim, you know, I may sugarcoat it a little bit if it's not, you know, if it's quite a like a not very nice subject, but I do almost tell them the truth about it. And my mum always says to me, oh God, you know what, why can't you just like not say that and just like not be that honest about everything? Because from that honesty then comes like another 1,000 questions from them, and then I have to spend, probably, if I could literally shut it down and be done in 30 seconds, but then an hour later they're asking me like a million questions about this thing, and then another thing, and then another thing. But I think that's a really important thing as well, being able to articulate, being able to understand and stuff. As you grow up, I think it's really important to be able to do that, because I think as much as I loved that my parents had shielded me from stuff, like as we were growing up, I think I lack the lack a little bit on like sort of like reflecting and like understanding some stuff. So I think it's really important about you know, wanting to be heard and wanting to be like spoken to and all of that, and be a part of a space together, rather than, you know, being separated in all these different rooms. You know, that room is for that, or that room is for that person. I think it's important that we can collectively be in a room together, no matter, you know, gender, age, or whatever. So I'm really interested in exploring all of that stuff.
Wow.
Sorry for going on.
No, that's good. There's a lot of things going around in my mind from what you're saying, and I think just from my own sort of experience, one of the things that really stood out to me about the front room is, in my family, it wasn't really that, I don't think it was as sacred as some of what I'm reading about or looking at and underestimated, but the elements of it were there in terms of just how it was decorated and how it was sometimes used. But one of the key things that I remember is, like, my granddad would go in there and have his quiet time and drink his whiskey and listen to his records, sitting under the floor lamp and just chilling. And he would sing on his own as well to some of the records that he had going on. And I think there's something about like that, also having that, even though it's a space where people also come together, there were times where it could just be, you would go in there with a purpose, like whatever that purpose was. If in my own family's front room, you just had to have, like, you could go in there, but you just had to have a purpose for being in there. Not just going in there like being idle or messing around too much, because you would sort of break the things that are kind of sacred or supposed to be in the space. And it was also the space where you did receive people outside the family. It was kept clean and tidy and stuff. But I don't think my family was that materialistic about it. In some ways I'm reading about. So yeah, I think there's something about like going in there with a purpose as well. But also being okay to just be. That can be a purpose. Your purpose can be to just be, like, chill, reflect, relax. And yeah, there was also a time where I think I took that into my teenage years, because my parents' house was being renovated and I had to stay at my grandparents for a while, because my parents' house didn't have a front room in that way. It was just a living room where everything happened. But the front room at my grandparents' house, I spent the time revising for my GCSEs in there while recording music off the radio. And there's something about just having that safe space to be able to develop and grow and be who I'm supposed to be, or become who I'm supposed to become in the world. And I think there's something about how we take some of those things and creating the front room where people can just be there, but also like move towards the purpose of the thing that they're trying to build or be in the world or in their community. And how we create the space for that is interesting. Yeah, some of my own reflections. But kind of going back to what's been discussed so far as well, I think an underlying theme as well, question that we have to ask as a team and in the community who's going to come on to help us like co-design, co-build the front room, is about how the rules are kind of set in this space. Like, how do we create those traditions and rituals? Like, because there's a lot of baggage that people will bring to the idea of the front room, like lots of hard things as well to unpack, just in the idea of the front room, and realizing that they can kind of reset the rules or make it what it needs to be for the neighbourhood, rather than actually come at the front room and think, oh, it's a place where I have to be a certain way to be accepted, or I have to be like how the front room was back in the day. Like, how do we address some of those things is, I think, what we need to think about as we go forward. So yeah, I'm seeing hands fly up, so go ahead, Amy, and then Byng.
One of the things I like about that very much compared to our previous journey at the hub was this like homogenous idea that everything can just coexist all at the same time, and by sticking people together, they'll figure out how to deal with all the different traditions and baggage and idea of space and what it means and how to coexist will just happen. And we never really intentionally thought about it in the way now. And I quite enjoy the idea that there's loads of different experiences of the front room, and it brings up good stuff and hard stuff, because it allows us to explore concepts that we might not ordinarily explore. And when you think about it, about the front room at a neighbourhood scale or in the commons, I think that's really important. With some of the work we've been doing with Andy and Pro-Social on the Eleanor Ostrom's principles of how you organise in the commons, like there's no one homogenous space that works in one way that everybody will just come to with zero baggage, zero childhood or previous experience, and we'll all just get along. And often things are designed like that. They're designed as if, you know, you deal with a couple of user types and it will just work for everyone. Whereas the idea of the front room and all this negotiation of even just within this team, let alone going broader, like saying, well, it doesn't really mean that to me, it means this to me, it means that to me, helps you to explore that space doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. At the same time, it helps to show those overlapping points. And finally, it helps to do the deliberative stuff. Like, so conversations are like, well, you know, we talked about it last week, me and Indy, just like, well, how do we talk to the kids about death, or how much do you want me to say, or how much don't you want me to say, or what's the rules with that room, or, you know, what, you have to have these conversations. And I think that so much of stuff in the commons is at the moment like this idea that we'll just co-design and co-build and everybody will just experience it in the same way, when then the truth is that it doesn't, because even if you want the same thing out of a space, the baggage you bring to it, the home experiences you bring to it, the difference of childhoods and all of this sort of stuff is like so broad. So I actually really am excited about the challenge of difference, of having to figure stuff out together, of having to like listen to what other people are saying about what space is, because we have that now in our family, whereas when we were younger everybody had kids, whereas now in the family is like half of us with kids and half without, well, a few without. And it's really interesting how we have to navigate what holidays mean, what time together means, what that all means, whereas we never did when we were younger. It was just, these are the rules and this is what you do. So I quite like the idea of that and how that. Cool.
I think you muted a little bit before you finished, but we'll go to Byng.
Yeah, you cut yourself off a little bit there, Bab. But yeah, the thing around rules, I've been thinking around a lot. So it really just made me think of something, particularly as everyone's mentioned sort of being on the receiving end of rules. I think we've all been on the receiving end of rules probably most of the time. And I'm interested in the direction of rules. So rather than rules happening to us or us designing rules and then them happening to others, like multiple directional rules. So I think that's the main problem, or the thing with the kind of, you know, the respect created in the front room and the kind of, I don't know, like parameters of the front room or the way to be in the front room. I think the problem is the lack of multi-directionalness of the rules rather than probably what they were. And if they'd been more multi-directional, then they could have changed and probably been quite useful. So there is obviously lots of usefulness in creating kind of a guide of how to be together, or like ways to navigate shared spaces that stop them descending into like chaos, or what one person's comfort might not be another person's comfort, and same with discomfort and stuff. So I'm interested in I just made a quick note so I don't forget, respect in all directions, I think, is what I'm interested in. So rather than, you know, people coming in to the front room for the first time and respect going in one direction or the other, it's respect in all directions. And also rules kind of adapting and getting smarter, I guess. Rules probably is obviously not the language we would ever use, but the whatever version of this, you know, Impact Hub had a sort of maker manifesto, and places will obviously give you ways to navigate how to be together, and families will navigate ways of how to be together in different ways. But I'm interested in the direction of travel for those rules or guides, for sure.
Cool. And I think, yeah, the thing about the respect as well, a big theme in the front room as well is respectability. There's this like difference with respect and respectability, and how people are trying to play up to some kind of ideal that others have set just to be accepted. And I think there's something about breaking down some of that as well, in how we set our rules and like deliberate over those things in the space, people being a part of that. Just want to acknowledge Net's comments, because Net has said, I don't remember having a front room that was separate from the living room. Having lived in a number of houses growing up, we played there, rarely had guests, but friends were allowed in there. And there were a lot of trinkets and such that were special. This is cool. I like that it's resonating, Nets. And I'll be interested to bring you on to like one of the future sessions that we're doing to kind of dig more into some of those things. And David as well. Yeah. So thanks for your comments.
David, speaking about the front room, that he kind of grew up in being decorated and like just modernized, but then people that then owned it gutted the whole place. They basically found this like wonderful Georgian fireplace that had literally been in that room for like the whole time. And I think even decor is such a part of that, and the space, and how we even view it, because you've got like so many people could have these beautiful hidden gems just there. Yeah.
And how those gems don't get lost, sort of thing, as we kind of modernise, I think is a thing that's coming up there. Hearing from Deborah now. Deborah says there's 2 really readable social history books, Lovers and Strangers, An Immigrant History of Post-War Britain by Claire Wills, The Dead Yard, A History of Modern Jamaica by Ian Thompson. Okay, we'll check those out, Deborah. Thanks for that.
I think that the kind of talk of decoration and sort of interior design, for want of a better word, really is quite interesting, in that I think the way that you kind of grow up within a space, you kind of maybe it starts to impact on your mindset as well, in terms of if you're kind of quite comfortable in things changing and evolving and adapting physically in form of decoration. And I say this because it's basically, my mum used to just, you'd go to school one day and then come back in the living room and be a completely different orientation. It would be all the same stuff, but it would be in a different place. And it was kind of her way of sort of mixing things up and trying stuff new and just figuring stuff out. And I think that kind of made quite a lasting impact on me around like thinking about things can be adaptable and changeable and not be so rigid in ideas. And I can feel like that kind of way that you relate to space in that sort of context then can feed into much bigger things as you go forward.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So one thing I wanted to share from this book here, that's got like all the things in there. So this book I've been looking at, and I haven't read all of it, but it's got like a lot of concepts and themes from the front room in history and stuff. But there was one thing that I was reading today, and it said that front rooms in the Caribbean would belong to the houses which had been occupied for several generations by the same family, and were therefore a repository of shared life across generations. Everything there had echoes of the other generation. 2 or 3 were present in the room, so 2 or 3 generations were always present in the room. And one thing I liked about it is that you had an excuse to interrogate grandma about the past of the family. And I thought what we might be able to take from an idea like that in terms of the journey that we've been on with sort of Impact Hub coming into Civic Square and the family of people around that. And how do we honour all of that in the front room in a way that helps other people move things forward? And I just wondered if you've got any sort of ideas around that or things that might come to mind.
Well, I've got a couple of things that I think are interesting in that is both the metaphorical, like how you bring learnings forward, and how you archive them, how you share what's happened in in a like sector that doesn't traditionally do that, and that has like fetishized innovation and like ripping things up and starting anew. So I'm quite interested in the kind of depth of how we build or go back to ideas that were thrown away as not important, almost like how you see people uncovering those old floors in Victorian houses and stuff. This period, modern period of capitalism, where we've lost connection with the things that take us forward, and that we need to reconnect with in lots of ways, whether it's like the climate story, or how we come out of everything with COVID. I think that it's about bringing those learnings and making them visible and honouring them and showing the growth from that, because I think metaphorically that's really important. It's really important to start doing that more visibly and viscerally in the work, because Silicon Valley culture has turned social innovation into this mockery of how we solve or work on our social challenges, and now people are waking up to the fact that so much of that knowledge, and when I say people I mean en masse, in indigenous cultures and our ancestors and many generations before us knew how to do so much of this stuff. Even the concept of the doily and how you maintain your furniture and how you look after things for a long time, you know, these were just normal things that throwaway culture or fast fashion lost for us for a bit. But then even like out of the metaphors, very physically with people, right, about how we connect and make new relationships and not get lost in just boundaries of geography, or just boundaries of postcodes, or just boundaries of interests and groups of people who should hang out together. I think one of the things from my front room is that there was so many different people we met all the time, like all the time. It was overwhelming in a way, but we just had so many families. Like I've got family that I'm really, really close to, that we speak to, have spoken to every day in lockdown since my grandmother died, and we're connected by great grandfather. That's how we're connected. Like we're about fourth cousins or something. So being able to grow that is really important. And I think because we had kids come to us as babies at Impact Hub Birmingham and are growing in so many different ways, I'm really interested in what a genuinely intergenerational space means. Especially like you're saying about there was often 2 or 3 generations in the same room. That's up until now, just these last weeks, that was our whole life, 2, 3, even 4 generations in the same room. What does that mean metaphorically and physically? Like, so not just kid-friendly spaces, but like that very loose learning from across the generations all the time, fluidly. It's normal, as opposed to a curated, okay, now the youngsters are going to learn from the older people. How do you do that and have that every single day? I'm interested in that because I think a lot of faith spaces make that happen, like at the Gurdwara, or for us that's really normal. Intergenerational spaces just there. How does that become part of it is one of the things. So metaphorically and physically, how do we take learnings and embed them, not get stuck on them, but use them to build the future and to share and pass on wisdom and learn from.
Yeah, thanks. Any other thoughts on that? Nope. Cool. I think that was I wanted to share that because I was thinking along some of those similar lines, Imi, and just I think that there's a lot that you could explore in just that idea when we create the space, and yeah. Zaz, do you want to say something?
Hello, yes. I was just going to say, part of what you read out when you were saying, kind of giving you that space to like interrogate your like grandparents about the past. Something that happened to me really recently was on the back of us speaking so much about the front room and having all of these kind of conversations come up, I was talking to my dad, and it was really the first time that I have spoken to my dad about this kind of stuff. It's things that I always think and feel, but it was really great, this moment of me just like talking to my dad about all these memories that I have, and him knowing exactly what I'm talking about, and knowing exactly what I mean or what I felt when I spoke about certain objects. But it was almost acted as this space where I was able to interrogate him as well about his experience. It's not something that I've ever spoken to him about, and it's almost like not just sharing that space of the front room or those memories just with myself, but actually reconnecting with my dad in that way, because out of everyone, my dad's the person that, you know, it was his parents' house, he grew up in that house, and it almost felt like a breath of like release almost, and having someone else be like, yeah, oh my gosh, do you remember this trinket, do you remember this, but yeah, those 2 white horses, do you remember this thing? And also having someone value it as much as I do, and probably even more, you know what I mean, because that was his lived experience. But it does create this space to interrogate in a way where it's like so normal and so natural, because you're just sharing. And I really loved like having that moment with my dad, but almost having all of these conversations, because that's what it pulls out, right? That community, but also who you are. And I think my dad realized how much of the person I am is based around all the things that he's experienced and knows too. And I think that kind of was like a shock, but a connect for him as well. And I thought that was really interesting, just having that space to share. Yeah,
for real. And I had a similar experience with my mum recently, just talking about the front room, because I was exploring it and just showing her this book as well. Yeah, she really started to really connected with it, and I just think that there's so much that we can do with this. So I'm really quite excited to see how it grows and how it develops, and with all the voices of everyone else in the neighbourhood around B16 in the future part of the furniture series and so on. I'm really excited to hear what else we'll learn and what else we can develop. So I just, to draw this to a close, just want to go around and just ask how you guys feeling in a word after this conversation. Just if someone shares one by one.
Thoughtful.
Yeah.
Hopeful.
Intrigued.
Nope, sorry.
Oh,
sorry, Indy.
Nikki said hopeful. Indy, what did you say?
intrigued.
Intrigued.
Creative. I feel creative.
Nice.
I feel full of contemplation. Good contemplation.
Yeah, I joined Danny. Reflective.
I mean, hungry, but also, yeah, confused in a good way.
There's a lot of paradoxes. I feel like my mind's been expanded. And with that, I'm going to draw this first part of the furniture series session to a close. And just to say that we have a whole series of stuff coming up this month. So sign up for the neighbourhood key on the front room website, which is thefrontroom.cc. And you can get access to these calls and the future series. The next series is going to be looking at the settee, and the settee is looking at spaces for deliberation and complex conversations. So join us next Monday around the same time to explore the settee, and we'll invite more people to come onto this conversation and to share like their experiences of like talking about the complex things and like what infrastructure we need for those. Yeah. So thanks for listening. Thanks to Nets, David and Deborah for joining us, and hope you can join us for the next one. So bye everyone.
Thanks, DB.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.